These were crimes of cruelty, deliberate, calculated acts stripped of all humanity. Britain has harbored killers whose depravity defies reason, leaving behind blood, mutilation, and a legacy that still haunts the nation's memory. In December 1811, East London was gripped by horror it had never known. In the early hours of the 8th, the Marr family, Timothy and his wife Celia, their 3-month-old son and their apprentice, were slaughtered inside their draper's shop on Ratcliffe Highway. Their skulls were shattered with a shipwright's maul, their throats cut so deeply the wounds gaped to the spine. Even the infant was not spared. Blood ran across the floorboards and pooled in the shop. The silence was broken only when a neighbour forced the door open and found the carnage. Less than 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the victims were the Williamson family, an elderly publican, his wife, and their servant. They too were bludgeoned and cut down in their own home. The speed, brutality, and apparent randomness of the killings paralysed the city with fear. No one knew when the killer might strike next, or why. Suspicion eventually fell on a seaman named John Williams, though he was found hanged in his cell before trial. Whether he took his own life or was silenced, no one could say. What remained certain was the depravity of the murders. 2 households annihilated, infants and the elderly alike reduced to butchered corpses, leaving London with a grim knowledge that even the home offered no refuge from such violence. Between the 1850s and 1870, Mary Ann Cotton left a trail of death that stretched across northern England. Outwardly a respectable wife and mother, she moved from marriage to marriage, home to home, leaving behind a string of funerals. Husbands, lovers, stepchildren, even her own infants, all sickened suddenly, all dead within days. The cause was always the same. Arsenic slipped into the food or tea. It was a slow killer, bringing agonizing stomach pains, vomiting, and exhaustion until the body gave out. Cotton was calm, attentive, and ready with comforting words, all while watching her victims die. Many of these deaths brought her small insurance payouts or relief from what she saw as burdens. She's believed to have murdered up to 21 people before suspicion finally caught her. In 1873, she was hanged for the killing of her stepson Charles, but her true count will never be known. Her crimes, they were methodical, patient acts of poison carried out in the safety of the home, where her victims never imagined the danger at their table. In the autumn of 1888, the narrow gaslit streets of Whitechapel became a hunting ground. Over the course of just a few months, at least 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were slaughtered with a savagery that stunned even the most hardened policeman. All were prostitutes working in the shadows of East London's poverty, and all were attacked in the dead of night. The killer's method was as deliberate as it was grotesque. Throats cut clean through to silence any cry, then mutilations that spoke of either a twisted fascination or surgical skill. Organs were removed, faces slashed, abdomens laid open. In Mary Jane Kelly's small single-room home, the violence reached its peak. Her body was almost unrecognizable. The walls splashed with blood, the air heavy with the smell of it when the door was forced open. Letters began arriving at police stations and newspapers, some signed with a name that would become infamous, Jack the Ripper. Whether the real killer wrote them or not, they fueled the terror, turning the murders into a national obsession. Patrols doubled, suspicion fell on neighbors and strangers alike. But the killer moved unseen, slipping away into the fog. The murders stopped as suddenly as they began, and the Ripper's identity remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. In modern times, one name dominates the discussion: Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber who lived in Whitechapel during the killings. Police at the time suspected him, and later memoirs from senior officers appeared to confirm it. More than a century later, DNA analysis of a shawl linked to one of the victims was claimed to match the descendants of Kamiński's family. But questions over evidence handling and contamination mean no court and no historian can say with certainty that he was the Ripper. What remains certain is the legacy, the calculated depravity that left women's bodies carved and guttered in the heart of the capital. While the Ripper stalked Whitechapel streets, another killer may have been at work, one who left less behind. Between 1887 and 1889, the mutilated remains of at least 4 women were found scattered across London. Limbs and torsos appeared in railway arches, in secluded yards, and most chillingly, in the Thames. Heads were often missing entirely, as if the killer wanted to erase identity itself. The first case in 1887 began when a woman's dismembered remains were pulled from the river. Over the next 2 years, more followed, more body parts wrapped in cloth, stuffed into boxes, or left in plain sight. Some discoveries overlapped with the Ripper murders, leading investigators to question whether London harboured not one monster, but 2. Unlike the Ripper's frenzied knife attacks in the street, these murders suggested time, privacy, and precision. Whoever was responsible had the skill to take the bodies apart cleanly, then dispose of them piece by piece, ensuring victims were never fully recovered. No one was ever charged, and the victims remain nameless. In the heart of Victorian London, it was Jack that claimed the spotlight, but in the shadows, another was quietly cutting women to pieces. In February 1942, wartime blackout cloaked Britain in shadows, and for 6 nights those shadows concealed a predator. Gordon Frederick Cummings, an RAF airman, used his uniform and easy charm to gain women's trust, turning on them with sudden, calculated violence. Over the course of that week, 4 women were murdered and 2 more were attacked. Some victims were strangled, others had their throats cut. Bodies were left posed, clothes torn, and in some cases mutilated. Wounds that served no purpose but cruelty. The speed of the killings and the way Cummings prowled in the enforced darkness created a sense that the city itself had become complicit, swallowing him up after each strike. His downfall came when one intended victim fought back, leaving behind a trail that led police to him. Cummings was arrested, still in uniform, tried and hanged within months. His brief reign of terror left a mark for its cold opportunism, proof that even in a nation already consumed by war, one man could find time and the darkness to kill for pleasure. In the late 1940s, John George Haigh presented himself as a well-dressed, smooth-talking businessman. Behind the polished image was a killer, with a method as methodical as it was grotesque. Haigh lured his victims, friends, business partners, even a wealthy couple he had charmed, to isolated workshops. There, he shot or bludgeoned them, stripped them of valuables, and set to work on the disposal. Using large drums, he filled them with sulfuric acid and left the bodies to dissolve. Within hours, flesh, organs, and bone turned to sludge. When the process was complete, he poured the remains down drains or onto waste ground, erasing almost every trace. Haigh believed that without a body, there could be no murder charge. For a time, it worked. Between 1944 and 1949, he killed at least 6 people, possibly more, enriching himself through their stolen money and possessions. His downfall came when traces of human fat, body parts, and personal belongings were found at his workshop. Haigh confessed with a chilling casualness, claiming he had drunk the blood of some of his victims, a detail never proven, but enough to seal his image as one of Britain's most depraved killers. In 1949, he was tried, convicted, and hanged, leaving behind the horror of a man who saw acid as the perfect tool for murder. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley carried out a series of murders that would sear their names into Britain's collective memory. Their victims were children and teenagers, 5 known in total, abducted from the streets of Manchester and its surrounding towns. Lured with promises of a lift or help for a small task, They were taken to Brady's home or to isolated areas, where the true horror began. The pair tortured their victims, sometimes for hours before killing them. At least one murder was recorded on audio tape, capturing the terrified pleas of a 10-year-old girl while Hindley's voice encouraged the abuse. Brady photographed some of the victims during the assaults, treating their suffering as trophies. Once the killings were done, the bodies were buried on Saddleworth Moor, the desolate landscape becoming a silent witness to their crimes. The investigation broke open in 1965 when Hindley's brother-in-law went to the police after witnessing Brady kill Edward Evans, a 17-year-old. Search teams began combing the moors, uncovering shallow graves. The haunting image of Hindley's mugshot, the cold, unflinching stare framed by bleached hair, became a symbol of the case's cruelty. Brady and Hindley were sentenced to life in prison. Brady would later admit to more murders, but never showed remorse, treating his crimes as acts of intellectual superiority. Hindley tried to win parole for decades, claiming reform, but public outrage kept her behind bars until her death. The moors still hold the body of at least one victim, never found. In the mid-1960s, the quiet woodlands of Cannock Chase in Staffordshire became the hunting ground for a predator. Raymond Leslie Morris was outwardly a respectable family man with a steady job, but beneath the facade was a calculating killer. He targeted young girls, always in daylight, approaching with a calm, almost friendly manner that lowered their guard. Once under his control, there was no mercy. These girls, 9-year-old Christine Darby, 6-year-old Margaret Reynolds, and 5-year-old Diane Tift, were abducted, assaulted, and murdered. Their bodies were left on the chase, and in some cases only partially concealed, as if Morris wanted them to be found. Police scoured the sprawling moorland and surrounding villages, but the killer stayed one step ahead. Each disappearance fueled panic, with parents keeping children indoors and the press calling the chase a place of nightmares. The breakthrough came in 1968 when witnesses placed Morris's car near the site of Christine Darby's abduction. He was already under suspicion for a string of attempted kidnappings, and forensic evidence tied him directly to her murder. Convicted in 1969, he was given a life sentence, though investigators believe he was responsible for other killings and possibly more. Morris died in prison in 2014, having never admitted guilt, leaving the families with no answers. From 1975 to 1980, fear gripped the north of England. Women were warned not to walk alone at night, but even in daylight the unease lingered. The killer the press named the Yorkshire Ripper was moving through the streets and back alleys of West Yorkshire and beyond, hunting with cold precision. His name was Peter Sutcliffe, a lorry driver with a quiet, unassuming manner, and a compulsion that left 13 women dead and at least 7 more seriously injured. Sutcliffe's attacks were sudden and brutal. He often struck from behind, using a hammer to crush the skull before stabbing or slashing his victims with a sharpened screwdriver. Many of the victims he targeted were sex workers, which initially led police to focus narrowly on that community, a mistake that allowed him to keep killing. Later victims were not sex workers, proving that his violence was opportunistic, driven by urge rather than victim type. The investigation became one of the largest in British history. Thousands of statements were taken, suspects were interviewed and cleared, and false leads followed. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax, letters and an audio tape sent to police claiming responsibility with a distinct Sunderland accent. Convinced it was genuine, detectives diverted their efforts north, letting the real killer continue unchecked. Sutcliffe's capture in 1981 was almost accidental. Stopped by police in Sheffield for driving with false number plates, he was found to have a hammer and knife in his car. Confronted with the evidence, he confessed to the murders and attacks in chilling detail, claiming he was on a mission from God to kill prostitutes. His trial revealed the sheer scale of his crimes, and he was given 20 concurrent life sentences, later converted to a whole life order. Sutcliffe spent the rest of his life in custody, dying in 2020. The damage left behind went far beyond the lives he took. Whole communities lived under his shadow for years, and the mishandled investigation remains one of the most heavily criticised in British policing history. Dennis Nilson turned his North London flats into places of death. Over almost 5 years, ending with his arrest in February 1983, at least 12 young men died at his hands, though he claimed the real number was closer to 15 or 16. Many were homeless, unemployed, or living on the edges of society, easy to lure with offers of food, drink, and a bed for the night. Once inside, Nilson waited until they were drunk or asleep before strangling them, sometimes finishing the act by drowning. The murders were only the start. Nilson kept the bodies for days or weeks, bathing and dressing them, seating them in armchairs, and speaking to them as if they were still alive. When decay made them impossible to keep, he dismembered the corpses. At his first flat on Melrose Avenue, the remains were burned in a garden bonfire mixed with rubbish to mask the smell. At Muswell Hill, with no garden, he hid parts under the floorboards, stored them in cupboards, or cut them into pieces small enough to flush down the drains. It was those drains that ended his killing. In February 1983, neighbours complained of blockages, and a plumber discovered rotting human flesh in the pipes. Police traced the source to Nilson's home, where he opened the door and, with chilling calm, confessed to killing 15 or 16 men. Tried later that year, Nilson attempted to claim diminished responsibility, but the jury found him guilty of 6 murders and 2 attempted murders. Sentenced to life with no chance of release, he died in May 2018, leaving behind one of the most disturbing legacies in British criminal history, a man who kept company with the dead as if they were living. Robert Black was a man parents didn't notice until it was too late. Working as a delivery driver across the UK in the late 1970s and 80s, he used his job to hunt. His targets were young girls, alone on short walks to school, to a shop, to meet friends, children who vanished in the small gaps of everyday life. Black's van became both trap and prison. Once inside, the girls were assaulted and strangled, their bodies sometimes driven for hours before being dumped hundreds of miles from home. He treated the open road as his cover, moving between towns and borders in a way that made him almost impossible to track. Police believe that Black's first confirmed killing was in 1981 when a 9-year-old Jennifer Cardy was abducted in Northern Ireland. Over the next decade, Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper were all taken and murdered in a similar fashion. Each case brought fear to entire communities, but the lack of a clear link between them kept him free. Investigators suspect his true victim count could be far higher, possibly stretching back to the late 1960s. His arrest in 1990 was a matter of timing. A witness spotted him bundling a girl into his van in Scotland. She survived, and Black was caught. DNA and forensic evidence eventually tied him to multiple murders, and he was given multiple life sentences. He died in 2016, never admitting the full extent of his crimes, a predator who turned Britain's roads into a hunting ground. Cromwell Street did not look like a house of horrors. Behind the front door at number 25, Fred and Rose West turned a family home into a site of torture and burial. Across the 1970s into 1987, girls and young women, lodgers, runaways, babysitters, and even their own daughter were restrained, assaulted, and murdered in a routine so practiced it felt industrial. Victims vanished into the cellar and garden, concrete was poured, rooms were refitted, life carried on upstairs as if nothing had happened. The pattern was calculated cruelty. Women were lured with offers of work or a bed, and then bound, gagged, and attacked over hours or days. When it was over, bodies were cut up and hidden under floorboards in the cellar or in the back garden. Police would later find multiple graves on the property, many with bindings still in place and small bones missing, hints of trophies taken from the dead. The house itself had been adapted to serve the violence, soundproofing, a fitted cellar, locks where locks shouldn't be. It began to unravel years later. In May 1992, when one of their children disclosed abuse, and in 1994, detectives dug up the garden for Heather West, who had gone to work, according to the family story, and never returned. Her remains were the first found. More followed in the cellar and beneath the patio. Fred confessed to a string of murders and hanged himself in prison on the 1st of January 1995. Rose went to trial that year, was convicted of 10 murders, and received a whole life order. The address was demolished, but the memory did not go with it. Britain's history is stained with shadows darker than most dare to face. These crimes ripped through towns and cities, haunting streets and homes, long after the killers were gone.